to start with, well, I'm really interested to hear how you're doing, how the situation is for you personally, because I think it's now the fourth week of the lockdown in Italy. So how have you been spending it?
Yeah, it's a very interesting experience, I must say. I think it's obviously a very difficult experience for everyone involved, a lot more difficult for some than for others. I'm lucky to be with my family, and we're have a little bit of opportunity to be outdoors as well. So I think it's in many ways more bearable than it is for many others. The thing that I've also noticed, also speaking to friends and to colleagues and so on, is that psychologically, I think some people are more, how can I say, suited to a situation of this kind, and others less. I think some of us have our kind of our character and our profile is such that we need to be in constant interaction with the world. But for other people, I've noticed, have kind of settled in much more and they're able to be productive. And I think this is, it really, it reveals a side of you that you're not really so familiar with normally, putting in these completely different conditions. And I think that it's very interesting to see also how this modifies your behavior, how you kind of adapt to it. And yeah, so it's an experience that I think it requires obviously a lot of sacrifice on the part of everybody for the greater good. But the nice thing about it is that the sacrifice is really universal. And so in a way it brings us all together. That's
Yeah. So I think you've been creative during this time from the first day on, no? So you a great digital social network series on for the Triennale called Decameron, which probably refers to Boccaccio, no? People
yeah,
in
exactly.
Villa. So can you tell us about the idea behind the Decameron series?
Yeah, so, well, basically what we're doing with Triennale, since the museum, like most museums, like also, I assume, Vitra Design Museum is these days closed, and it's not possible to have the normal interaction we have with our audience. We immediately began thinking about how social media platforms could be an alternative channel, and immediately, actually, this the kind of narrative, this sort of narrative structure of Decameron's Boccaccio came to mind because I mean it's one of the great works of Italian literature that tells the story of 10 young Florentine aristocrats who, during the plague of the 16th century in Florence, they had to essentially self-isolate. They decide to, one of them has a villa in the countryside, so they decide to all go to the villa to escape the plague and to pass the time together waiting for things to get better. And so while they're there, they to pass the time, they didn't have Instagram Live, they didn't have any sort of connectivity, so they simply take it upon themselves each day to tell a story to the others to keep themselves entertained. And so the book is in fact a collection of stories that are in a way the record of this reciprocal entertaining. Of course this didn't really take place, but that's the narrative structure of the book. And the stories are a little bit, how can I say, raunchy and transgressive in some ways. And in fact, they became the starting point for a very beautiful film by Pierpaolo Pasolini, also called Decameron, which I would very much advise everybody. The way that we interpreted this instead was that we would each day invite one of our friends, colleagues, somebody who had something that we thought had something interesting to say, whether they were an artist or a designer or a philosopher or even a prime minister. The other day we had Edi Rama, the prime minister of Albania, at 5 o'clock to join us on the Instagram of Triennale to talk about the current situation, to bring something, to offer something. At the beginning, they were a little bit more, how can I say, performative, because we were still able to access the building, so we would invite artists to come and to maybe do some kind of a performance inside the building space. On other days, they're much more meditative. We've had philosophers bringing some really great reflections, and so this kind of, and now of course they're all completely remote. It's not possible to go into the building at all now. But in a way, I think what is interesting is that as people coming from so many different backgrounds and directions, and with so many different sort of personal experiences of this situation, everyone has something to bring and to share and to enrich this moment. So I mean, it's a very small thing. It's not comparable, of course, to a normal program of Triennale, but it's something, and I think the community has really appreciated it.
Well, what I really admired is how fast you reacted. You know, you decisions to come up with such an idea, and then it's, you know, it's not just saying we do some digital talks, but you link it to an historical event, which or a work of literature, which also shows a certain scope of your thinking. And then today, Joseph, you sent me a text that you recently wrote, and a few days ago you texted me that this lockdown also helps you to really reflect on certain things that needed to be thought about, and you didn't have time to think about before. And in that text, you establish connections to some rupture that happened between the decline of the Roman Empire and the early Middle Ages, where also some really fundamental changes happened in the way how we look at our economies, at our cultures. So can you elaborate a little bit on that thought that you had in that text?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the kind of the starting point of the text is, I actually kind of started from this being in Assisi, which, as many of our listeners will know, is a small hill town in central Italy, a medieval hill town that is best known as the birthplace of St. Francis. And St. Francis is an interesting character because, apart from being the patron saint of Italy and one of the sort of cardinal figures of the kind of the Christian religion, or Catholic religion at least, he's also credited as being the first Italian poet, the first poet to write in the modern Italian language, and also as really one of the kind of founding figures of the idea of environmentalism, of sort of thinking about our relationship with nature and the landscape. And one of the things that struck me, kind of seeing Assisi completely empty, like every other town and every other city completely empty, is normally, of course, Assisi in this season is completely preparing for the new influx of tourists, of people, pilgrims, people coming from all over the world, partly for a spiritual attraction to St. Francis himself, but also because Assisi is this incredibly beautiful hill town that contains some of the most beautiful architecture of Italy and some of the most important frescoes by Giotto, Cimabue, and so on. And so this kind of seeing Assisi kind of brought to mind the historical precedent of the fact that Italy, in a way, the history of Italy is dominated by you could even say the kind of the current economy of Italy, which is largely dependent on tourism and on visitors and on its artistic heritage. It has two moments of glory, and of course the one that is historically most prominent is the Roman Empire. It was the center of this empire that expanded across the whole of the known world, almost all of the known world, from the English Isles down into Africa and across into Asia, and really something that had no precedent at that time, very little precedent at that time. But that's not actually the reason, even though maybe that's the most historically important time of Italy's greatest, Rome's greatest power and importance. That's not actually the reason why many people come to Italy. Of course, maybe they do come to see the Colosseum and Roman ruins, and there's some incredibly beautiful art, but the vast majority of Italy's art is actually from a later period, from the Middle Ages, which for many years were known as the Dark Ages, a sort of a time of ignorance and of and of darkness. But in fact, the the Middle Ages represent the founding basis for everything that is here in Assisi, but also for the Renaissance, for this great rebirth of art and culture and knowledge in Italy. And if you think about one, it's actually kind of the inverse of the other. The Roman Empire, which is in many ways quite similar, I think, to the kind of civilization that we live in now, which was of expansionist connectivity and of relatively centralized power that reaches across the universe, across the world, that is very much based on centralization within cities. Cities were the dominant model of the Roman Empire, and they still are the dominant, or they have become again the dominant model of our civilization now. The Roman Empire essentially collapsed under the weight of its own complexity, and this economy of scale that it had set up at some point, in fact, became entirely unsustainable. And in a way, Assisi is really the expression of another model, another economy, another civilization that came out of that collapse, which is an economy, and this is really kind of very much also inspired by Michel Bowen's writing, the founder of the Peer-to-Peer Foundation and a very smart economist and historian. The idea of the Middle Ages as the establishment of a completely new decentralized economy that is based on small centers and on monasteries as their sort of, at least in Italy or Europe, for the production of knowledge, which produced a completely different model of economy, of art, of culture. And I think that this is, it's an interesting moment to reflect on this transition, this evolution that occurred, one inside the other. It wasn't really a revolution or something that happened quickly. But I think these are interesting moments to think about how we can really invent a new model that is fundamentally different in its premises, that's not about scale, it's not about necessarily kind of expansionist scope of empire, but very much more of kind of connected nodes. And maybe also something beautiful like the frescoes of Giotto and Cimabue can come out of this. I think it should be a message of hope, not of desperation, this moment of questioning.
Mm. And from there in your text, you create a link to Buckminster Fuller, who said that for him a lot of his thinking came out of situations of crisis or of failure. So is that something that you think current designers could refer to if they think about what can they learn from the current situation?
What the phrase of Buckminster Fuller, who is for me very much a kind of I think in this moment a figure in need of rediscovery, is he said that most of my breakthroughs occurred by accident. I started by removing what was not, and then I was left with what is. And so I think the relevance to this particular moment is that somewhat involuntarily we've been forced to remove a whole series of things from our lives that we, I think 2 months ago, would have thought were completely unthinkable. Our freedom of movement, but a lot of freedoms. But more specifically, automobiles removed from the cities, planes removed from the skies, our sort of frenetic tendency to movement being completely removed from our schedules of everyday life. And this situation of subtraction lends itself to actually questioning how many of these things are necessary, how many of them are important, and how many are crucial for our everyday life. And I think that the point in terms of where designers come into this is that I think there's an urgent need for a recognition that just as the pandemic, the coronavirus crisis cannot be solved through individual action, through kind of making small changes to this and that and the other, it necessarily requires coordinated action on the part of everyone together. And similarly, it is the real crisis of art is not, I think, it's obvious that it's the climate crisis, and we need to think about the what we have seen these days, this kind of ability to so a visit from my daughter just popped in to say hi.
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 Well, I have to change well, because I need to connect my phone.
Okay.
Do that very quickly, but
of course.
now
But yeah, so similarly, just saying that I think that this is a very interesting sort of almost group test or exercise for the same kind of drastic action that's going to need to be taken in the coming years for the rest of in terms of trying to think about how we're going to deal with this looming climate crisis. And I think the point is that we inevitably need to take collective action. We need to be prepared for sacrifice, and we've seen it in these days. There is more or less, apart from kind of very specific conditions where there is, I think, an awareness on the part of everybody that we want central power, our governments, to take significant action. And we as designers should be thinking about how we can think about an alternative reality that is conducive to life, that isn't completely kind of exploitative or extractive in terms of our relationship with the landscape and with the environment, and begin planning that, because that's ultimately what is going to be needed.
Well, I think one aspect is that what can designers do to solve the current situation of the lockdown. The other one is really what is structurally necessary. And I think one reason for the pandemic that we're currently discussing a lot or hearing about a lot is that we've gotten very close to nature, and that our lifestyle has been so invasive that we're getting close to species that we had been remote of before. And by that, viruses like the current one can come from wildlife onto human beings. So I think it's a very specific change that happens, but on the other hand, it's very emblematic for a general problem in our lifestyles, right?
Yeah, I think it's the human condition is one that is inherently, or our relationship to nature is one that is at this point entirely designed. There's nothing so quote unquote natural about it. There's the natural landscape, the natural environment is ultimately pretty much at this point the product of a very long extended design process that has left very little to be unintentional, and this process has been characterized by a series of sort of problematics and crises and situations that would have been completely unplanned for, but at each point has been the kind of the stepping stone to arrive at a different level of I don't know, intelligence or awareness of the world around us. It's also what drives science, I think, which is a very. I think it's a moment also of you could say great. I think I find it very reassuring in terms of it's the kind of way that it brings the human species together at this point. Maybe not in. It's not like suddenly there's been any sort of transformation, a fundamental transformation in our nature. We still remain a kind of a combative, hostile species. But if nothing else, then at least some kind of external enemy, collective enemy, has demonstrated that there is something that ultimately we all share, and that's something that I think we just need to channel in a new direction.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe let's come back to that at the end of our discussion. How can we channel that, and how can we make something last from the learnings? But in the meanwhile, let's speak also about an exhibition that we have at the museum at the moment, Joseph, where you collaborated as the exhibition designer, but also as a curatorial consultant, with whom we had really very inspiring discussions. It's the exhibition Home Stories, 100 Years, 20 Visionary Interiors. So what we try to do in that exhibition is to follow the evolution of the modern interior. So we look back at the 20th century and try to identify 20 interiors, each of which stands for one shift, for one really breakthrough in the history of the interior. And We had you as our guest, as one of our guests for the opening talk, which was in early February. So it's not so long ago, less than 2 months, but somehow it feels like it was in another age.
Indeed.
So that's why I thought, you know, it's no objection to have you as a guest today in the talk, even though we spoke publicly 2 months ago. In that talk, Joseph, you said that you would not consider an interior so much under aesthetic criteria, but rather as a symbol, or maybe also as a battleground of the socio-political forces of its time. So you were really advocating for this more political notion of an interior. If we look at that from the perspective that we have now, not in beginning of February, where also the way how we today live our interiors has completely changed. What do you think has changed for you personally, looking at interiors today?
Mm. I think it's kind of ironic that this exhibition that we worked on, Home Stories, remains largely unvisited because everybody's locked inside their homes. So in a way, we have to rethink it in a way you could describe it as being incredibly timely, or either very good timing or very bad timing. I think certainly
of the exhibition.
Yeah, I think we're all going to come out of this experience with a much stronger appreciation for our homes and for domestic space, and the importance of domesticity, because we'd all sort of a little bit kind of were tempted to look at it as something that was much more important in the previous era and now less. But in fact, I think, if anything, we've been shown that our homes are the places of last retreat. It's where we kind of by default we sort of run to when things start to get bad outside, and so therefore they do even today. There's a very heavy significance and importance, and I think that the events of this time underline the point that you reminded that I made during this talk about the home as a question that is, of course, the kind of the outcome is to be appreciated aesthetically. There is some incredibly beautiful design in this exhibition as well, some homes that I would really very gladly call my own. But the real point is that ultimately the home it plays a very significant role in terms of the expression of democracy, like the equal access to home, to living, to having a residence. It's something that I think, again, in these days, it's becoming very also a topic of debate. The fact that, okay, we do a lockdown, everybody self-isolate inside their home, but what if they don't have a home? What of the underprivileged to have several people living in a very small space? What of those who are not able to isolate from their co-inhabitants because they don't have a room of their own? All of these questions, I think, are brought back into focus about the ongoing housing crisis is really something that will always remain relevant. The point of a democratic society giving its citizens access to somewhere to live that is able to provide for their kind of essential needs, which remain the same throughout time, physiological needs, is something that is as important now as it ever was before. And I think one of the ironies of the current situation is that there is a very big company that we know as Airbnb that has been one of the, in a way, the perpetrators, or has gained extreme success and wealth from the past years of kind of frantic rootlessness, of frantic movement around the world, a tendency for kind of less and less importance and attachment to a single place, because we increasingly spend time sort of scattered all over for work, holidays, and all sorts of other reasons, is in fact in these days on the verge of going bankrupt, because of course they have this ridiculously huge staff that they took on due to a sort of growth-based model that now is essentially completely useless and is also stripped of any possible revenue. So that's kind of an irony that one of the one of the organizations that got us into this mess in the first place is now a little bit sort of suffering consequences itself. But of course, I mean, this will pass, and I'm not worried about Airbnb or anybody else. But I think the point is that all of this idea of domesticity essentially kind of taking on a role that is much closer to that of an asset, of a financial instrument, is in stark contrast with the kind of fundamental role of the home as the building block of democratic society. And I'm not talking about the kind of nuclear family, but the individual's right to have a decent and decorous place to live, I think remains crucial, and we're being really reminded of that in these days. So my hope is that we come out of this crisis with a new appreciation for the significance and the importance within a stable democratic society for access to appropriate dwelling places for all, and that as a consequence also as designers, as museums, as cultural institutions, we're also able to become a vehicle for really kind of reasserting the fundamental importance of the home. So I think that, hopefully the exhibition will be extended a little bit and we'll have the chance to come back and visit it.
Working on it. But you were mentioning that, yes, the situation might raise the appreciation of the home, and probably it might also sharpen our view for some aspects which are essential in a home, no? Today, in these days, of course, is access to communication still.
Mm-hmm.
But if we think about certain homes where the surface is too small, I think in this situation of a lockdown, we may also see serious problems in domestic violence. So
absolutely. I think it all comes back to the same. It's not only, of course, the first level is access to any kind of home at all, which for some is a problem. But beyond that, there's also a question of access to a home that is suitably sized, comfortable, and proportionate to the needs of the people who inhabit it, which increasingly has become a luxury. I mean, simply having a bedroom, we get to the stage in the sort of extremely overpriced urban centers of the world that are the drivers of the current sort of economic, of our current economy, where, I mean, anything more than basically having a few square meters is essentially a luxury. And I think it really is and it kind of goes back to the point of before of like the way that we have structured our economies around concentration, around centralization, around the kind of the dogma of density in a way, I think is something that needs to be re-examined from all sorts of perspectives. It's really, I think, coming to the point of unsustainability.
In the exhibition, there are many examples, even if we have only chosen 20, where innovation also in the home emerged from a situation of crisis. If we look at the 1920s, we have an example from Das Neue Frankfurt, where there was a serious housing shortage, and architects collaborated on creating really affordable and functional domestic space in the 1920s. Then we have the post-war times, when it was again about creating affordable living space. Or we look at the late 1960s, 70s, where there were social ruptures, and that was reflected in the way how an interior was conceived, with less formal divisions. This whole movement towards informality was visible in the home. Is there something in these historical examples that one can see in the history of interiors where you would think we could connect to today?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always going to be designers and architects will always play a key role in finding a kind of a trajectory for the expression or responding to the kind of question that's being put to them, and articulating or finding a kind of an equilibrium between the sort of the constraints and the opportunities that the situation presents. I think that right now the problem is that there is essentially, the problem that I have is that sometimes there's a sort of question, okay, well, what can designers do, as though designers are going to be the answer to the problem. And I think in this particular moment, the problem is not a design problem, strictly speaking, but it's a political problem. We have a whole range of issues facing us collectively as a society, not just as designers, but really as a society, as a community, that really need to be sorted out on a political level. And the first stage that needs to happen, like we were saying before, is extreme action, the kind of taking awareness that the action that needs to be taken is going to demand sacrifice from everybody. Whether it's, and you could be talking here about I don't know, the housing crisis. I think it needs to be kind of a fundamental rethinking of that, but more of the city, the configuration of the city, and how we can organize our work and so on. But beyond that, more broadly speaking, the whole sort of material economy that we have set up, which is essentially based on a model of perpetual growth, is something that we all know deep down is not going to be possible to continue. And at some point we have to face up to the fact that it's not going to be simply technology saves us because we bring in electric cars and therefore so it's fine, we can just go on like before. There needs to be a point where, yes, I mean, bringing in smarter technologies is part of the answer, but there also needs to be a point where we also kind of ask ourselves collectively, what are we prepared to give up? And I think especially in the north of the world has a huge debt towards the south of the world, and we need to ask ourselves, rather than, okay, well, how are we going to bring all of the south into the northern sort of level of wealth, and then from there, then figure out how technology is going to save us from our sort of the vast sort of impending climate doom that is facing us. Instead, I think it needs to be a question of how are we going to actually to what level are we actually prepared to individually offer something up? What are we prepared individually to sacrifice in order to be able to collectively all live in a way that is that is essentially compatible with the conditions that this planet offers us? And that's where design can then really kind of kick in and begin to offer models, new models for collective living, new models for, I don't know, for an urban design that doesn't require us to be car dependent, that moves to the other side of the city every time we need to go to work, things like this. But above this is a problem that is not, designers on their own are not going to solve this problem. And I think that's something that we need to, and also us as individual citizens are not going to solve this problem. This is a problem on a political, on a level that can only be addressed at the political, like the pandemic. It's exactly the same.
Where you say designers cannot solve it alone, but maybe they can contribute to helping to add solutions for single problems. This may also help. And Joseph, besides your role at the Triennale Design Museum, you're also the artistic director of the Design Academy Eindhoven, and there you have initiated a new curriculum called Geodesign. So I suppose this also goes in a similar direction, no? That you realize that design on a small scale is not really appropriate to cope with the challenges we have and with the scale of those challenges. And you want to encourage designers to really think about the large scale, about probably global scales. Can you tell us more about this? How could this work, and what kind of projects do you have in mind there?
Yeah, I think the sort of philosophy that we adopt at the Design Academy in this particular moment in history is the idea that as a designer, as one of the few figures that's able to take on the complexity of the problems that face us as a species, and also the complexity of everyday life in the 21st century, which is essentially the convergence of forces and of demands and of problematics from all sorts of different directions. And designers are essentially by their nature team workers, and the kind of breed of designers that we hope will come out of the Design Academy is really one that is accustomed to thinking about problems on the scale of on a planetary scale, and thinking about, most importantly, thinking about opportunities on a planetary scale within this kind of incredibly complex web of economic, geopolitical, and material flows that constitute everyday life. One of the things that I find really interesting about these days is the way that the pandemic has actually kind of brought to a sudden halt or it hasn't completely brought to a halt, but it's made much more complicated the practice of transnational of transportation of goods, services, and all sorts of and the commerce across borders. Like, borders have suddenly come back to be very, very real. And so that has exposed the complexity of the supply chains that lead to almost everything that we purchase or buy or is sent to us, how complex that supply chain is, from the transport, the logistics, the distributors, the manufacturers, the material extraction, like all of these things, like how far all of this goes back. And that kind of becomes, events like this one make all of that very clear and visible. There's a brilliant newsletter that the Bloomberg business magazine started just a few days ago, after the pandemic crisis really kind of start to take force, which is called Supply Lines. I think you can subscribe to it for free. And it's absolutely fascinating on a daily basis to see this report of all of the weird things that are going on as a consequence of the this current situation. So, for example, just to give you one from today's Supply Lines newsletter, 50 tons of fresh roses are being destroyed every day in, I think it's Kenya or some African republic, which is where African nation, which is where the where these roses come from. Which, first, A, I didn't know that the roses were being grown in Central Africa. B, it's just completely mind-blowing to think that, of course, they just don't know what to do with these roses, so they have to destroy them. C, the fact that it's so many, like 50 tons per day. I mean, it's just like all of these things that are just the regular normality of everyday life in the 21st century suddenly become clear and evident. So the idea of geodesign is to kind of set up a research, a rapid response research lab that that is capable of looking at these events or certain topics from the perspective of a strategic designer, of this kind of new breed of designers that is capable of metabolizing complexity and that's capable of really kind of creating connections between apparently unconnected things. And so the latest episode, the latest installment of this is, in fact, on the coronavirus. So we're using this time as a way of kind of collecting perspectives and analyzing facts on the ground on a day-to-day basis, and hoping then to find a way to translate all of this into something that goes beyond simply a sort of a journalistic documentation, but also, like you were saying before, what can designers do? We need to create the platforms and the instruments also on an institutional level to rethink this role of the designer in order to be able to deal with these kind of problems, not like what the next chair is going to look like, because I think that and then the chair will be an expression of a worldview on a much larger scale. But first we need to start from this sort of planetary scale, taking stock.
The first teachers that you appointed for this course are former Fantastic. we're having an exhibition at the Serpentine at the moment. Well, I'm not
Yeah.
sure if it's right to say they are having an exhibition, but the exhibition is at the Serpentine. It's about wood and the global chains of production and use of wood. And our listeners probably also know the work, the Ore Stream project by Forma Phantasma, where they also refer to electronic waste or digital waste that circulates the world. So it's probably these kinds of projects by Forma Phantasma that you find when you were appointing them, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the thing about Forma Phantasma that is interesting is, A, they are really accustomed to this idea of investigating complexity, of parsing reality and looking at design as something that has no boundaries. Like, this is really the crucial starting point, is that there is no boundary between design and the rest of the world, or of cultural production, or of professional practice. Like, everything is design. We need to be able to really immerse ourselves in realities that we would not normally be dealing with, like the waste streams of electronics, or like the reality of an epidemiological reality of a pandemic. They, I think, are extremely relevant to this problem, because, or to the kind of the topic of geodesign, because because essentially, I mean, from a design perspective, it ultimately comes back to a question of resource allocation and of material flows. Resource allocation is very much a political problem. Material flows are very much a design problem. And all of their work, I think, really has this sort of obsessive return of interest to materials, to the question of how materials are perceived, how the economies behind these materials, the power struggles behind these materials, and yeah, I mean, they're absolutely a natural fit for this role, and I think it's going to be very exciting to see what comes out of this new department.
Joseph, shall we take some questions?
Absolutely.
Yes. So I'm checking if there are some.
Manus Lung makes a very good point that I shouldn't be touching my own face. Okay, sorry.
Well, I don't see more comments coming in. I don't know if that function. No, I just see some emojis. So if there are any questions, you could submit them now. No questions, just comments.
I'll have a question for you. Give us a bit of insight into the Berlin situation, how you're living this lockdown, family life.
Well, it's challenging. But I come back to that later. There was a question called, what is the future of the furniture industry? Joseph, do you want to comment on that? It's a little far from what we've discussed, but is there anything you would like to comment on?
What will you take from the Corona situation moving forward digitally? I definitely hope this will encourage work, employers to accept much more remote working, much more meetings, remote meetings. I think anything that allows us to continue to be productive while doing less traveling is very, very welcome. And I think that this is really like a crash course in how to be productive remotely. So I think we also, as both as employers, but also as employees and workers, we're all learning how to do this much better. So I hope that will remain. What does this mean for the future of the furniture industry? Well, my hope is always that, and that goes back to another question that I saw about fiberglass chairs. There's this sort of almost, what could I say, visceral aversion to fiberglass chairs because they're not recyclable. My position on that is, and this is kind of answering the question also about the future of the furniture industry, is I don't think, this is probably a little bit controversial, I don't think that we should first of all be thinking about how we recycle the things that we make. Mm. We should be thinking about how we make things that are going to last essentially forever. Now, chairs, I think for the foreseeable future of humanity is going to need to sit down. So there's absolutely no reason why we should be planning for the obsolescence of chairs. Chairs are going to essentially be useful forever. So we should be making chairs that last forever. And fiberglass is actually a very good material for making chairs that last forever. So I think that recycling is important for objects that we don't necessarily want to last forever, or things that we don't need forever. But I think the whole of the furniture industry needs to be thinking about imposing upon itself the obligation to only make things that will last essentially forever. That's how it was, and that's how it should be once again. And the whole sort of rhetoric and discourse about making things out of bioplastic and so on, absolutely. If we can make them out of things that when they're finished can be made into plastic cups or whatever, excellent. But that's not the priority. The priority is to make very few things, to buy very few things, and the things that we make, they just should, that's it. You make that choice and that's it. So to kind of escape from the cycle of perpetual consumption as a kind of driver of the economy, we essentially need to think about an economy that isn't based on continually purchasing new stuff. It's just completely not possible.
Yes, I totally agree. I think we don't. There's different typologies of objects. No, there's typologies of objects that have the potential to last forever, and there it's more reasonable to try to achieve or to go within that direction. And there will always be objects in a category that may deteriorate, and then we will have to think about the circular economy, but probably not for objects that cost a few €100, where it just doesn't make sense to throw them away after a while if they can still be used. Joseph, there was another question that may refer to both of us, which is what can be the role of design museums or museums in general in that time? I would say something that we're doing right now is like a live example of what we can do. So we can try to keep up the conversation and to also continue trying to initiate discussions. No? And I think each museum has its own perspective, the perspective of the discipline it represents, from the fine art, from architecture, from design, and all these disciplines have something to contribute to the current discussion. So what are the discussions that you are having at the Triennale in Milan about what can be your role right now?
Well, one of the things about the Triennale is that it's an unusual... I lost you there a second. It's an unusual museum because it's actually... we have our normal programming like you do, but then every 3 years we have a major international exhibition, the Triennale, which addresses a specific theme and is also open to participations from different countries around the world. So in that sense, the Triennale is a platform for really kind of asking some crucial questions on that really do sort of open up a planetary forum for how design is to shape our collective future. And so this is really something we've been thinking about a lot in these days, is once all of this is over and there's a certain kind of return to normality, how can we actually capture some of this and a different kind of energy? I think there's obviously a lot of difficulty, a lot of suffering, a lot of sacrifices, but also a lot of really amazing energy in these days, new ideas, a desire to relate in new ways. And this will is something that we hope we can channel into this major international exhibition that will be able to really also kind of bring also onto political level some of the kind of big questions. Yeah, I mean, I think in this specific moment we have to really kind of take this moment of reflection and discussion on the gravity of the responsibility of what needs to lie ahead. I think you know very well my position about exhibitions. I think we have a huge responsibility as museums, as cultural centers, to not be wasteful. I think there's a lot more that we need to do with our exhibitions, because exhibitions are actually a huge generator of waste, and so we need to also change a little bit our approach, the culture around this, to not be continually expecting fancy, flashy new setups, but also to be thinking more about what's on top of the tables than what the tables themselves look like. Maybe that's not so important. Yeah, so
design for the home stories exhibition look beautiful. So.
They do, but I think if we can, I think we should still design beautiful things, but we should again design them to last essentially forever, and think about how they can be reinterpreted over and over again, and also ask to our audience, please don't expect from us to be continually providing new spectacle. Just that you should make this into a kind of a value for you as an audience when you see things reproposed, rather than just kind of continually kind of expecting this to be something new and fresh and exciting. But instead, I think we need to change a little bit the culture of expectation around exhibitions as well.
Yes. Well, I think Joseph, we leave it with that. There's some really interesting questions that are still coming in, but I think we could continue endlessly to answer them. I'm really happy that so many of you visitors followed this talk. So we're going to have another one next week, probably next Thursday. So if you're there again, you can submit more questions, and I mean, I have to learn still how to handle that format, so probably next time I bring an analog pen and write some of the questions down, so we can really store them and then answer a few more of them. But I think so far, Joseph, the conversation was super interesting. Thanks so much, and it was really good to see you after such a while.
Definitely.
That you're enjoying the blue sky and the birds.
Yeah, indeed, indeed.
Wish you a good continuation in your isolation, and really my best wishes to Italy. Best wishes
Likewise.
to the Triennale also. We all hope we museums can reopen again and also start our conversations in real time again very soon.
Absolutely. I'm sure.
Thanks so much. See you soon, and thanks
See you soon
for having joined us. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.